First of all, from an electoral point of view, how important is the black and ethnic minority vote?
It's pretty important now. About a quarter of Labour's votes are ethnic minorities, rather less amongst Conservatives. But the important thing that we show, and in fact the Conservative think tank Policy Exchange demonstrated this a couple of months ago, is that over the next 25 years, the minority share of the electorate is going to climb. And in fact, it's climbing more rapidly in this country than anywhere in Europe. In about 25 years' time, it'll be about could be up to 40% of the electorate. So decisions made now will really have a major impact on parties' outcomes over the next 20 to 25 years.
Right, so one could say that Labour has an inbuilt advantage, if you like, because of tradition and history. Is that changing, or will they still be the beneficiaries of that increasing share of the vote in the next few elections?
Well, it's changing a bit, but it's certainly not changing at the rate that anybody imagined it would do. You know, it used to be the case that Labour would take about 80–85% of the minority vote. Now it's about 70%. But there's actually no indication that that's going to change dramatically. And by the way, there's no history anywhere in the Western world of what you might call a culturally inflected vote changing its choice very rapidly. It takes generations.
Right, well, that's going to make it very difficult for you, isn't it, if you just look at the numbers and the numbers that have been voting for Labour in the past. If the number of black and ethnic minority voters continues to go up and it's a very slow swap over to the Conservatives, you're going to struggle to win an outright majority.
I think Trevor's right on this point. It is long-term. But I think sometimes on the debate on this, we miss perhaps the most obvious point, which is, as a child of immigrants, first, second generation, maybe third generation immigrants, people from a BME background, they come here to this country because they're ambitious. They want a better future for their children, they want the best schooling they can. And I think if we as a party can actually tie that in and make sure our values resonate there,
But you failed to do that so far, haven't you?
Well, as Trevor said, this is long-term, and it's about being consistent and actually making sure we get that message across. Talk about our Conservative values in a positive way, about how they are actually those first, second generation, third generation immigrant values.
Labour has taken that vote for granted, which is why you're obviously losing your share, albeit slowly losing your share of that vote. Do you accept that?
Well, you won't be surprised to hear, actually, Joe, that I don't accept that. And I don't accept that Labour takes any votes for granted. I think what is really
They've been accused of taking their hinterland, their working-class white voters for granted, and also the ethnic minority vote.
I think what's really important is you look at about consistency here. Politics is about relationships with communities, and it's also about how you reflect what people's needs are within a political discourse. And Labour's had a very strong history with the Race Relations Act in 1968 and then ongoing since then. Issues like how you see representation in public life and politics. We've actually had greater numbers of ethnic minorities coming in forward in our party and in our politics, but also we've seen measures like diversity targets on public boards, which the Conservatives took away. I think what you've got to say is how are political parties representing the needs and the issues of our diverse communities in politics, and on that Labour's had a very consistent record and takes the issue extremely seriously.
Do you think there was a perception, or the perception that the Tories were anti-immigrant? Do you think that still exists, that legacy, and that's what's hampering your attempts to attract and woo more ethnic minority voters?
Well, you're talking to a Member of Parliament who represents Enoch Powell's old seat as an East African Sikh. The irony is quite strong there. I have to say the chances of me making a controversial speech about race relations in 16 years' time is remote, but you never say never in politics. Look, I think it's a very simple message. BME voters are no different from anybody else. They have the same values. It's just us tying in and making sure that we make that connection, which I think is the important thing.
But I think there's just one other point there, which is it's true they're no different from anybody else. They're making decisions about how they're affected by the cost of living crisis right now, people who come with their housing problems, with employment problems. But there are actually still fundamental inequalities in our society, which I think politics has to represent, whether that is the higher levels of unemployment in BME communities, how that differs by different areas, whether that is representation and fair treatment with our public services. So I think on those matters you can't gloss over them. You have to say, does politics represent them?
You are glossing over
I'm very glad that Seema's actually raised this point, because over the last... she's right, there's an issue around unemployment in BME communities, but if you look at the last 5 years, we've seen a real narrowing of the gap amongst young black men in terms of levels of unemployment, and generally across BME communities as a whole. Look, the important point is about social mobility. Nobody from a BME background, if you're really candid with them, wants wants a positive discrimination. What they want is equal access and a fair crack of the whip.
Right, but do they see that as linked to the Conservative Party? I mean, that's the point, isn't it? Do they, which policies could they say, if you're from an ethnic minority community, say that's because of a Conservative or a coalition government?
I'll give you a specific example of that. I'm a product of social mobility. I've come from state school and an FE college. That's not the normal route for a Member of Parliament.
Well, but you've done that before, obviously, the coalition government.
But I've done that. But what we've done is, rather than taking the BME vote as a block vote, we've actually engaged with them and asked for them to provide solutions. So, in the constituency I represent, there is a Sikh ethos-free school which is open to everybody from every background and actually pursuing academic excellence. Those are clear concrete policies.
What do you say about the question, is there an ethnic minority vote?
Well, look, I think there's a species of political denial which afflicts all British politics. In the United States, everybody accepts that the best predictor of how you're going to vote is your race. That is not quite true here, but it is rather true. The reason minorities don't vote for Conservatives is they think Conservatives don't like them. That's a fundamental point, and that is more important to them than any of the issues that you've mentioned. In relation to Labour, one of the very interesting pieces of research that came out of the 2010 election was that Labour supporters, black or white non-white, had no difference really in their views about economy, all of those kinds of issues. There's only one thing that minority Labour voters and white Labour voters differed on, and that is attitudes to immigration. And the gap between white Labour supporters and minority Labour supporters was as big as the gap between white Labour supporters and white Conservative supporters. So the point I'm making here is, it is true that on a lot of issues, minority voters aren't particularly different to white voters, but the things they think are most important do make them very, very different from other voters.
And in order to increase representation, ethnic minority shortlists, are they a good thing?
Well, I think what is really important is that we see across the board people are coming through in every aspect of our pipeline into our politics. So in our community, in my community, for example, in my constituency, we have people who are active within our political networks, whether they're from African backgrounds, Sri Lankans, Indians, other South Asians, Pakistanis. I think what you've got to see is you see people coming through who are feeling that they're valued, part of that sphere of politics, people who are coming forward as councillors, people who are coming forward to stand for Parliament.
So
very, very briefly.
For a lot of these voters, by the way, the most important thing, irrespective of the economy and all the rest of it, for them is the presence of people like Paul and Seema in frontline politics. That's what actually makes a difference to them.
You better get out on the campaign trail then, both of you, hadn't you? Got 10 months to go. Now, thank you both of you.